네, 안녕하세요. 저는 한국장애인 문화예술원에서 공연장 운영을 맡고 있는 오세형이라고 합니다. 이렇게 이른 아침부터 와주셔서 감사합니다. 네. 간단하게 저희 오늘 발제자는 이제 소개해드리고 이제 모더레이터 분을 소개해드리고 내려가도록 하겠습니다. 저희가 벌써 이제 오전마다 강의를 하느라고 여러 번 오신 분도 계신데 바쁜 와중에 이른 아침부터 관심을 가지고 와주셔서 감사드리고요. 저는 먼저 소개해드리자면 이제 50대 아시아계 남성이고 키는 한 175cm 정도 됩니다. 그리고 검은색 자켓과 이제 베이지색 바지와 검은색 신발을 신고 이렇게 서 있습니다. 네, 추워서 조금 이제 난방이 좀 있어 올라올 텐데요. 좀 기다려 주시면 따뜻해질 것 같습니다. 오늘 강의는 저희 이 모두 예술 주간의 이제 주제인 장애 예술 관련된 저희가 매니페스토 선언이라고 이제 주제를 정했는데요. 그 강연을 대변해 주실 강의라고 보시면 될 것 같습니다. 그래서 장애예술 미학의 명명과 주장이라는 타이틀로 강의를 하시고요. 캐리 샌달 교수님이 강의를 해주실 겁니다. 오늘 강의와 뒤에 토론을 이제 맡아 주실 분은 김원영 작가님이십니다. 공연 예술가이시고요. 최근 장애 그리고 예술, 법 규범의 관계를 다루는 작업을 해 오셨습니다. 많이들 아시겠지만 실격당한 자들을 위한 변론이라는 책을 쓰셨고요. 사이보그가 되다라는 책을 공동 집필하셨습니다. 논픽션입니다. 그리고 사랑 및 우정에서의 차별금지법, 그리고 무용수 대기, 현실 원칙 등의 공연을 만들고 출연하셨습니다. 무용수 배우로 활동하고 계시고 그 이외에도 국가인권위원회, 법무법인 덕수 등에서 법률가로서 일한 경력이 있으십니다. 오늘 바쁘신 와중에도 너무나 관심이 있으셔서 이 진행을 맡겠다고 이제 하셔서 저희가 오늘 모셨습니다. 오늘 진행을 맡아주실 우리 김원영 변호사님 앞으로 모시겠습니다. 큰 박수로 맞이해 주세요.
네, 안녕하세요. 소개받은 김원영입니다. 제가 아침에 뭘 잘 하지 않습니다. 아침에 집을 나오는 것이 매우 부담스럽기 때문에 제가 아침에 출근하는 직장을 더 이상 다니지 않게 된 이유인데요. 그런데 오늘은 제가 기꺼이 자진해서 이렇게 할 수 있는지 제안이 왔을 때 덥석 하겠다라고 말씀을 드렸습니다. 그것은 제가 오늘 이야기해 주실 캐리 샌달 교수님을 이전부터 글을 통해서 만나왔기 때문인데요. 아마 저뿐만이 아니고 많은 장애와 특히 공연 예술에 관한 관심이 있으신 분들이라면 누구나 이미 알고 계시는 그런 분이실 거라고 생각합니다. 저도 뭐 간단하게 저를 언어로 소개한다면 저는 나이와 키를 이야기하지 않겠습니다. 그것은 시각적 정보, 청각적 정보로 아마 경험되시는 그대로일 것입니다. 그래서 다른 것들 위주로 말씀드리면 저도 휠체어에 앉아 있고요. 그리고 가디건, 약간 두꺼운 가디건을 입고 있습니다. 그리고 이 무대를 정면에 두었을 때 왼쪽 편 테이블에 제가 있고요. 그리고 약 한 2m 정도 떨어진 위치에 우리 캐리 샌달 오늘 강의를 맡아주실 교수님이 앉아 계십니다. 그리고 그 가운데 스크린이 지금 수어 통역과 문자 그리고 저희들의 모습을 보여주고 있습니다. 그럼 강연을 듣기에 앞서서 캐리 샌달 교수님 어쨌든 우리가 너무 잘 아는 분이긴 하지만 그래도 좀 최근의 활동을 포함해서 간단하게 좀 소개해 드릴게요. 캐리 샌달 교수님은 시카고 일리노이 대학교 장애 및 인간 발달학 그 전공에서 이제 학생들을 가르치고 계시고요. 그리고 장애예술과 문화 연구를 이끄는 역할을 계속 맡아오고 계십니다. 그리고 이 장애예술 시카고 일리노이 대학교의 장애예술 문화 및 인문학 프로그램을 이제 개설하셨고요. 학교 내에. 그리고 여기에 Bodies of Work BOW라고 하는 단체를 지금 이제 이끌어가고 계십니다. 그리고 장애를 주제로 한 다양한 예술 작품들을 이제 기획하고 또 이렇게 발전시키는데 기여하셨습니다. 하고 계십니다. 인종과 계급, 젠더, 섹슈얼리티 것들과 교차하는 장애에 관한 중요한 주제들을 계속해서 다뤄오고 계십니다. 그리고 이제 아마도 이제 저를 포함해서 장애와 공연 예술에 관심이 있는 분들이 가장 잘 알고 있는 책이죠. 소란스러운 몸, 장애와 퍼포먼스, Bodies in Commotion이라는 책으로 매우 잘 소개가 되어 계십니다. 그 책의 편저자이시죠. 편집자이자 저자이십니다. 그리고 또 유명한 논문 중에 하나이기도 한데요. 크립과 퀴어의 관계를 다룬 퀴어를 크리핑하기, 크립을 퀴어링하기라고 하는 또 아주 잘 알려진 논문이 있습니다. 그리고 이제 그리고 이제 베를린 슈블레스 박물관에서 장편 다큐멘터리 영화 코드 오브 더 프릭스라는 작업도 최근에 하셨고, 이 작업을 이제 그 유럽과 미국뿐만 아니라 아시아에도 이제 소개하시려고 이제 소개하시고자 지금 아까 좀 전에 제가 이야기를 나눴는데요. 네. 이런 어떤 그 공연 예술과 또 소수자들의 신체 그리고 다양한 문화적, 정치적 정체성의 교차들, 이런 관계들을 계속해서 탐구하면서 장애 예술 분야에서 중요한 작업들을 해오고 계십니다. 자, 그러면 이제 오늘 지금부터 캐리 샌달 교수님의 직접 이 자리에서 하시고 싶은 주제들에 대해서 한번 저희 같이 들어보는 시간을 갖고 저희가 한 5분 정도 쉬었다가 Q&A 세션과 토론 시간으로 이렇게 쭉 이어서 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 네, 그러면 오늘 강연을 맡은 캐리 샌달 교수님을 이야기를 들어보겠습니다. 박수를 쳐볼까요?
Good morning. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I would like to thank the organizers of today's event and the access providers. I'm very happy to be here. To give you a visual description of myself, I am a white woman, middle age. I have straight blonde hair, chin length, and glasses. I'm wearing a black blazer. I was very excited about the theme for the Disability Arts Week, which is Disability Arts Manifesto. And a manifesto is a way to begin, a way to define, and a way to declare. So when I was thinking about my talk for today, I thought that I would share with you some of the work that we're doing in Chicago to claim and name and define what disability art and culture is and how we are generating some new possibilities in the field. So my question that I want to explore throughout today's talk is what happens when disabled artists turn their attention away from trying to fit in, trying to be normal, stop trying to fit into mainstream society. At least in the United States, when we are included in the arts, it's usually done as a way to provide access or accommodation so we can participate in what the mainstream is doing. But it has been our experience of disabled artists in the United States that oftentimes when we try to do things on the terms of mainstream society, we will never succeed because we are being judged by norms that were created not with us in mind. So instead, what we're doing is starting with who we are. What is it that we experience? What is our what is our way of perceiving the world? So it's about creating new forms, new artwork, rather than trying to adjust ourselves to the mainstream. So I'll be giving you some examples of what that is. So the artists that I tend to work with are those who claim a radical outsider identity. So we do believe in disability rights. We want to be able to participate in the mainstream. And at the same time, we want to spend time with each other, developing our own aesthetics. So it's a way of kind of being both in the mainstream and outside, because by being outside, we can change what is inside. I hope that makes sense. I will give you some examples. But we like to really think about how do our particular bodies, how do our particular bodies function? How does that give us insight into how we perceive the world? And how do our senses operate? How do we think? How do we feel? And how can we express that through the arts? So I will give you a map of today's talk. I'm going to start with some guiding definitions along the themes of the manifesto. And I'm going to talk about what we use in bodies of work as our guiding definition of disability art. And then I'm going to give you some observations that I've made about the aesthetics that are emerging from this work. And then I'm going to talk about a process. How do we start creating something new that centers disability? So I'm going to talk about a working process. And then I'm going to show you some brief examples of some of the work that we've developed. So all of my training and my background is in theater and performance. However, it seems like it's a similar situation here and across the world. There are very few disabled people who have been trained in the field. So very few of us have university or repertory training, and it makes it very difficult then to create a movement just in one field. So you'll find a few trained disabled people in theater, you'll find a few in dance, you'll find some in the visual arts, but by and large, we're spread out. There's not enough of us in any one place to, I think, really do a lot of creating new work. So what we do is collaborate across art forms. So we'll be working with dancers, with visual artists, like painters, musicians, sculptors, whatever form we're working in, we have the same questions. And we find that when we work together, we can make new projects. That kind of solves the issue of it there not being enough of us in any one field. So let me advance the slide. Okay. So let's start with how might we define disability art? This definition is one that we use in Chicago. And if you go to different places in the world, or even in the United States, you will find people with different definitions. But it's good to have a place to start. So the first definition is that it refers to creative work by people with disabilities that reflects a disability experience, either in content or in form. So I'm going to explain what I mean by that. So the work reflects a disability experience, but that doesn't mean that it is quote unquote about disability. You could be, for instance, an abstract painter, and you might not know from looking at the painting that it was done by someone with a disability. But What we're interested in is artists who are curious about how their bodies, their minds, their senses are reflected in their process and in the artwork. So instead of trying to, for instance, hold a paintbrush in a way that creates brush strokes that maybe are normative, the artists we would work with would be experimenting with new ways to paint. It might not be obvious when you look at it, but the artist is interested in talking with other disabled people and with their audiences about new ways of doing things. So that's the form. And then content, of course, would be work where disabled people are sharing their experiences of disability, perhaps through storytelling or narrative. The artwork can include non-disabled allies whose work explores a disability experience. This one is kind of controversial. If you go to other countries, for instance, they might be very adamant that it's only work by disabled people. But when we're curating, we will sometimes include people without disabilities, but who have a deep experience and commitment to centering disabled people. It's also found in all artistic media, from the performing arts to literature, visual arts, comic books, film, design. It's everywhere. And it's shown in spaces that are accessible and with accommodations already in place. And this is important because it's a solidarity among disabled people. So if you consider yourself part of the disability art movement, and let's say you're a painter, you would not exhibit the work in a space where people with physical disabilities could not go. So when we are sharing the work, people with disabilities already know that if they go to one of our events, that access will already be there. They don't have to ask ahead of time. And that's really important to us. And the other defining quality is that the work is made with audiences in mind of people who have disabilities and people without. So a lot of times you will see work by disabled people that explains themselves to audiences. And what we're trying to do is kind of interrupt that expectation that we teach about disability. Instead, we want to move into things that are interesting to us, that other disabled people might be able to engage with. And if non-disabled people, if they don't understand it, then I guess they can go to Google and do some research. So that's a different way of thinking about disability. There used to be an expectation that we always explain ourselves before we can do the kind of work we want to do. So when I look out across the field and see what people are creating, I have noticed some qualities that are emerged of the work, and this is what I'm calling disability aesthetics. And is this the slide? Is this the disability aesthetics slide? Okay, thank you. So by aesthetics, I mean the principles of art and also of artistic taste. So it's not just what is beautiful, it's what I'm seeing as the principles and the nature of what makes art pleasing. So what might be pleasing to disabled audience members might not necessarily be what is beautiful. but it's something that appeals to disabled audiences. And often the characteristics of our impairments become translated as artistic choices or the principles of art and design. So, for instance, if I'm a dancer and I use a wheelchair, I might be translating my experience of what it is like to be moving in a wheelchair and center my artistic choices based on how I move, right? Rather than on how non-disabled people move. Also, we see an alternative set of values that are pleasing and meaningful to disabled people as they are reflected in representation. I'm going to be giving you some examples that will help explain what some of these values might be. So, how do disabled artists and their non-disabled allies generate new work that expresses innovative disability aesthetics? Because we're trying to create something new, again, rather than adapt ourselves to the mainstream. And I like to start with what I call a disability representational conundrum. So what is that? A representational conundrum is a term that I have coined to describe challenging, puzzling, or paradoxical issues that are unique to or complicated by disability's presence. So when we're working with each other as disabled artists, we often have questions that come up that cannot be solved. There's no answer to them. And instead of trying to make something fit, we go to the places where there is no answer to generate new work. I'll give you some examples. So we begin with this conundrum. So I direct a program called the 3 Arts Bodies of Work residency at the University of Illinois at Chicago. 3 Arts is a granting organization that funds women artists, artists with disabilities, and artists of color. So they provide the funding in collaboration with my organization, Bodies of Work, and it is a 3-month artist residency that is developed new with each artist. One of the things that we noticed is that a lot of times when you go to apply to a grant, there's a set of expectations already about what they're looking for as an outcome. And instead, what we do is we go to the artist and we say, what is it that you are interested in working on? And then we collaborate with arts organizations throughout Chicago and with our university to support the artist. So it's customized to what an artist is interested in pursuing. And we start by, again, identifying this representational conundrum. So we engage audiences in programming, and the idea is to increase the public dialogue around disability arts, culture, and aesthetics. So this is important because when we choose artists, we're looking for people who are very interested in disability community. I don't know what the situation is in Korea, but in the United States, because there are so few of us, teachers often don't know how to teach us. And so we come into a situation that may or may not be accessible, but then there's not a curriculum for us. So we're trying to develop that work together. The other thing that happens is oftentimes non-disabled people don't know how to give us feedback. So you don't necessarily know how to improve because our work doesn't look like other people's. It's difficult then to give criticism. And one of the things that we're trying to focus on is when disabled artists are working together, we can give each other hard questions. We can critique one another. And that's the kind of feedback you need to grow. So I call this a disability dramaturgical practice. So, I was trained in theater, and the practice of dramaturgy is working with the director and with the production team to provide research, to give feedback, and to help identify your common purpose. And so I bring all of my training as a dramaturg to working with artists. This is a theater term or a theater role, but I translate it to working with artists in any field. So when we start with this representational conundrum that we identify, then we focus on creating new work that tends to explore these aspects of our identities. We want to understand the emotional and physical experiences of impairment. So in the US and in the UK and other English-speaking countries, we often distinguish between disability and impairment. So impairment might be your actual physical or mental or sensory difference, or what could be considered your diagnosis. And disability is the social phenomenon around that, how you interact with the world and how your body and your mind might experience differences based on the world not being made for you. So one of the things that we focus on is, instead of pretending like we don't have disabilities, we really think deeply about what does it mean to be in the body that you have? What does it mean, for instance, if you have chronic pain? In US culture, there's a huge pressure to overcome your disability, to make people think that you don't, that you've succeeded by conquering your disability. We're not interested in that. We're interested in what are you experiencing in your body right now. Don't overcome it. What is it that you're experiencing? I think a lot of us, and I don't know if maybe other disabled people in the room have this experience, but we're often taught to ignore our body's signals. For instance, if you undergo a lot of physical therapy, you're pushed and pushed and pushed to be as normal as possible. So like when I was younger, when I was little, the pressure was always to walk. And we have a saying, I don't know if you do here, that is, if there's no pain, there's no gain. So we're taught to kind of not listen to our bodies. So we're taught to overcome, to push through pain, to ignore what our bodies are telling us. So if we pay attention instead, this is actually, I think, a difficult thing for a lot of us, to actually pay attention to what our bodies are feeling. And then also, what is our emotions with that? Instead of trying to just push past it or ignore it, what does it mean when we pay attention? And so that attention can also go to proprioception. That is, how does your body move in space? How are you aware of your surroundings and how you take up space? And then also through interoception. Interoception is paying attention to how your body is feeling from the inside. So you have the experiencing your body out in space, and also a concentration of what you feel inside. And then we pay attention to how we experience time. Because disabled people often have a different relationship to time. And instead of pretending that we don't, we explore what is our relationship to time. So if I'm in my wheelchair and the ground is flat, I can go very quickly. I can go faster than my husband when we're walking. Right? I experience time sped up. If I'm on my crutches, I'm extremely slow. Okay, and I'm moving differently. I'm moving my arms, my shoulders, by putting pressure on the ground. But if I'm in my wheelchair, I'm pushing my wheels and I can zoom across space. So that's how we think about time. How do we also build time into our process so that we have time to rest, so that we can stop work when our bodies are tired or in pain? And the way I was trained in theater, you had to stick to a very strict schedule of time, right? Of rehearsals, of performance. And so we're trying to experiment with what does representation look like when we allow time to match our bodies instead of making our bodies match time. Okay. And another thing we explore is different ways to take up space. So if you're, I like to use dance as an example a lot because I think it's a form that's easier to visualize. So if you are, I'm going to use the example of a wheelchair dancer again. When we are dancing, we often, in our chairs, can experience the space of the floor. It's very horizontal. So I've worked with dancers who have built ramps on the stage so that you can experience vertical planes, spirals, exploring all the ways that space, how our bodies move when you're in a different plane, whether you're high or you're low. So I don't know, have a lot of you seen wheelchair dance? Maybe raise your hand if you have. Some? Okay. So a lot of times you'll see dancers moving around on the stage, but you won't see people going up high or going low unless you get out of your wheelchair. So we're trying to think about how do we represent or explore on stage, for instance, what it's like to go down a steep hill, what it's like to move your chair up a hill. And because the stage is built for non-disabled people, it's not built to showcase how our bodies move. Okay, so that's an example of space. I thought I'd drink some water while the interpreter catches up. And then we can think about narrative. What stories do we have to tell? And the stories that disabled people have to tell are often far more interesting than you see in Hollywood movies. So you were talking about the movie that we made called Code of the Freaks. That was a movie that took 10 years to make, and it came out in March of 2020, right when everything was shutting down. But it's a movie that explores how disabled people are represented in Hollywood. And one of the things that we argue is that whenever disability appears on stage, in film, in narrative, audiences expect that the disability will be explained. Right? So if you see a movie and there's a person who's, for instance, using a wheelchair, then you're probably going to wonder, why is that character using a wheelchair? Right? There's an expectation that it's part of the story. We're interested in different stories that might not be familiar. We work against those narratives that people are used to from Hollywood because they're very limiting. And then we are also interested in disability culture or community. Disability culture is intentionally a separate space from mainstream. So it might be places where disability activists gather. It might be cultural institutions such as this one that is being created for disabled people to create. What does it mean to be in community? So if you're watching a Hollywood movie, how many disabled people do you see per movie? Usually one, right? There's usually one disabled character. No. So but in disability culture or community in our work, we show disabled people together. And that's unusual in the US, and I'm not sure about here. But when you watch movies where there's disabled characters, do you usually see more than one at a time? Okay. So what is it like when we are together? And that's what I think this wonderful organization is going to give the opportunity to do. And then also, how do we think about access and accommodations when we include them from the beginning? So traditionally what happens is, let's say you create a theater piece, access might be added on later. So you'll have audio description, like when we introduced ourselves by describing our appearance for people who are blind or low vision. What does it mean if you, instead of adding that on, audio description becomes part of the piece? Or what does it mean if sign language interpretation is built in, or captioning? So instead of something separate, it's part of the piece from the beginning. That's something we're experimenting with. So let me give you an example of one artist that I worked with. His name is Matt Bodette. Matt is a person who identifies himself as having mental illness. He identifies as having schizophrenia. And the representational conundrum that we decided to explore is, how do you exteriorize a hidden disability? So if you are someone like Matt who has schizophrenia, if you see him on the street, you don't know that he has a disability necessarily, because you can't see it on his body. And so he created a theater piece called Edge Sharp Mind that was performed at Steppenwolf Theater in Chicago. And this was a performance art piece in which he was creating a representation of how he experiences time, space, emotion. He was trying to get to the sense of fragmentation that exists in him through his schizophrenia. So how does he represent what schizophrenia feels like, right? Without telling a story about it. Instead, he's representing it here on stage. So the performance consisted of himself present on stage, and there were 2 screens. And the performance mostly consisted of him getting in and out of a chair. And then there was images of him doing that were pre-recorded earlier. So it was very fragmented. It was one activity, but it kept repeating over and over in a different sequence. And when we first started working together, he had not collaborated with other disabled people before. And so then he started to think about audio description. And because 3 different things were going on simultaneously, we had 3 different audio describers for each element. And while the performance was happening, the audio describers would be speaking over one another. So you had 3 voices that you could hear, but they were describing different parts of the stage. And that was first done as a way to provide an accommodation, and then he said that it actually perfectly represented what it was like when he hears voices as someone with schizophrenia. So this is a good example of when you're working in disability community, sometimes when you're making the work accessible, it actually can represent something about your experience because you're in community that he didn't think of before. Before the voices were inside his head, but through this process of the accommodation, it became part of the piece. Okay. This dancer is named Chris Lenzo, and the representational conundrum we were working on was how do you, quote unquote, dance disability without disabling yourself? So Chris is a fantastic dancer. He uses a wheelchair. He was in an industrial accident when he was younger, and he lost both of his legs. So his legs end like at mid-thigh. And he is a well-known disabled dancer in the US and Chicago, and he is known for very athletic performances. So he's done aerial work where he's been suspended by cables and dances, with other dancers in wheelchairs whirring them, around. And so he's very well known for this work. But what was happening was that he was injuring himself by dancing. So you already have a disability, and then through dance, he was becoming more disabled. And it's part of dance culture for dancers to become disabled. Because like an athlete, both athletes and dancers over their career become disabled. And then usually they will stop dancing and become choreographers or coaches. They'll move into something else, and their career will be as a dancer on stage might be over. But if you already have a disability, what does that mean? So we created new choreography with his collaborator, Sarah Cullen Fuller, and we have a concept that came out of this that we call sustainable choreography. And sustainable choreography is choreography that doesn't injure. So there's nothing about this dance that will injure his body as he experiences it now. He's released from that pressure to perform this incredibly athletic work that he had been doing. It also had variations. So depending on what his body was feeling, there would be different options for the choreography. So if he has a lot of pain in his shoulders, and so if his pain was very bad on a certain day, there would be another option for that part of the piece. So thinking about how his body varies from day to day was built in so that he could always have choices in the choreography where he would not be hurting himself further. He's also aging. He's not a young dancer anymore. And so the piece was about his journey, his aging journey. And we were trying to think in the terms of the narrative arc of the piece, of how do you describe a journey without it becoming an inspirational narrative. Right? That's a trap that we tend to fall into. So he wanted to explore pain and fatigue and aging without it becoming a story of failure and triumph. So that's what we were doing partly with the choreography. Another thing that occurs is disabled dancers often don't perform very often on a concert stage. I'm not sure if that's just the way it is here. He would be asked to perform at a conference or in a classroom or at an outdoor festival. So the idea of sustainable choreography for us was, how do you sustain a career? So the dance and the choreography was then something he could own because he had the rights to it. And it was a performance designed to be performed on different types of surfaces. So he could accept paying jobs no matter where they took place. And if you come to the workshop, I'll show you the dance. I have a 3-minute piece of the dance that we created. So that was some of the essentials of Chris Lenzo's work. This piece, so I'm checking my timer here, how I'm doing on time. Okay. This piece was with an artist named Rebecca Torres. And Rebecca is a costume designer and a photographer and documentary filmmaker. And when we were working together, she was very interested in finding disability kinship or disability history in the arts. She is someone who was not born with her disability, but also acquired it in an accident. So she was trying to find, a lineage to study. And when you look at the history of Western art, often you can't find disability. Where are the disabled artists? Of course they're there, but they might not be identifiable. So she collaborated with Miriam Paré, who is a woman with quadriplegia who's a mouth painter. So she paints with a brush in her mouth. And Tara Aron, who worked on manipulating some of the images digitally. Rebecca is also Mexican-American. So she was exploring her Mexican-American identity, her identity as a woman, identity as a woman who uses a wheelchair. So she created a series of images where she would take works from Western art and put disabled people in them. So for instance, she did the famous painting of The Last Supper, but it was all disabled people in the roles. Take famous iconic paintings and put disabled people in them. And it made people question. It just created a lot of really interesting conversation of what it means to not be expected and to show up where you're not expected. So this piece here is, it is a part of the series where she put herself and Miriam in the painting of Frida Kahlo's Dos Fridas. So this is have you seen this portrait? Do you know the artist Frida Kahlo? So Rebecca is, I can't see behind me, she is in the purple and green dress, and Miriam is in the white dress. So they put themselves in their own power wheelchairs in the same position as the figures in the original painting. Rebecca made the costumes. The costumes are in the image. And there was a wonderful exhibition and installation where the costumes that Rebecca made for all of the paintings were on display, and where all of the artists who were in the paintings were present. So it was kind of like a performance installation. And one of the things that was really wonderful about that is it was presenting that idea of disabled people inserting themselves into culture, claiming that history for themselves, and also putting their bodies, literally putting their bodies in artwork, in art history. Around a few years later, there was an exhibit in Chicago, the immersive Frida Kahlo. Do you have these here? They have like the immersive Vincent van Gogh. They're big multimedia installations where you have sound and you have visual imagery, where you're supposed to feel like you're inside a painting. Well, we had this come to Chicago, this very big, large-scale event about Frida Kahlo. And the disability community, of course, wanted to go because who would, she's a famous disabled painter. But the space was not accessible. So this is a situation, what happens in the mainstream is they'll take an artist with a disability, and clearly it's not for disabled people, even though it's about us. So I have this slide here to show the difference of disability art and mainstream art about disability. One of my fellow artists who went to this performance, he got stuck on a ramp going up. The ramp was not accessible, and then when he dislodged himself, his chair went backwards, and he was tipping and falling and injured himself at this exhibit. So most of the exhibit was not accessible by wheelchair, and the parts that were accessible were dangerous. So this is a contrast. So if we go back to, this one is. If we go back to Rebecca's piece, the difference is disabled people are there. They're physically there. Their bodies have informed what the piece looks like. The costumes are made for their disabled bodies. So that's the kind of intervention we're talking about. How do you put your body in space where our participation is expected? Okay, so the next piece I want to share with you is by an artist named Andy Slater. And Andy is blind, and he's a sound artist. And the conundrum that he wanted to work on is how do we share sensory experience in an inter-impairment setting? So what that means is he's blind and he has a certain experience of sound. He uses sound to help him navigate space. He often uses a clicker. It's a little device that, like kind of about this shape, that you click and then you can hear the sound bouncing off the walls to know where you are in space. It's an echolocation. Are you familiar with this kind of device? Okay. It's just like it makes a loud click sound. And then he can hear it bouncing off surfaces and he will know where he is in space. So he was wanting to share what he experiences in a public space with people with different types of impairments. And he made sound recordings on busy streets in Chicago. There were sounds of the L train. There were sounds of crowds. He was trying to give audiences a sense of how disorienting it can be as a blind person to make his way around the city. Because when the trains come by, they're extremely loud, and then he can lose his sense of where he is. So that was what he wanted to explore, but he didn't want to give people a sense that it was not a simulation. So he didn't want people to think they could understand blindness by listening to the sound. He wanted to do something different. He made it into a piece of sound art. The image of Andy standing on stage is a presentation he did about his project. And he created this very funny satire that the audience didn't realize was satire. Okay. What he did was he created a fictional lecture, and then he was making fun of the idea that hearing or sighted people think that blind people have superpowers with their hearing. And so this is a quote from his lecture. And this is totally made up. He said, "I came across a thread on Blindness Forum talking about a doctor who had been censored because of her controversial research in the field of blindness and hallucinations. Director Janet Herman of Duke theorized that the majority of blind people could in fact hear better than sighted people, and that their own personal relationship with sound provided them with a unique harmonic consciousness that enabled them to hear trans-dimensional sounds. She called this cryptoacoustic auditory non-hallucination. The key here is on the non-prefix. She believed that these experiences were not an artifact of dementia or any type of psychosis. These experiences seem to occur as naturally as anything else in a person's waking life." So then I'll pause for a moment. Basically, he was saying that there was research that blind people could hear sounds that no one else could hear, and that they could, it was basically like they could communicate with aliens. And the audience completely believed him that this was true. And so he created this sound exhibit, and he wanted to make these sounds accessible to people who were deaf. And so when people were experiencing sound, he wanted the sign language interpreters to be able to interpret the sounds. And he wanted the captioners to describe the sounds. But typically, sign language interpretation of sound is often at least in American Sign Language, the interpreter will perhaps sway with the music or give a sense of the timing of the music or the sounds, but it's not really very descriptive of what the music is. So what he did was he created sound descriptions that then the interpreters could use and the captioners could use. And these were very creative. I'm going to share some of these with you. So this was his verbal interpretation of the sounds for the interpreters. Okay, I'm going to try to do this slowly because they're very funny. He said, "This sounds like a robotic rhinoceros pulling a barb from his foot." Okay, the next one. "This sounds like an old man sharing a water pipe with a cricket." Okay? This sounds like a sloth installing telephone lines onto a wooden pole. Okay, and the last one I'm sharing is, this is the robot I heard on the train. It beeps in a somewhat threatening tone, but you know that it is most likely harmless. So these were very funny. There were like small poems of the sound, so that then the interpreters and the captioners. But then what happened was that blind people wanted to know what these phrases were, because they were made visual, but blind people couldn't see them. So then he had to make, he made braille versions of these sentences, and they became a book. So then we had accommodations of accommodations. And he ended up developing this kind of sound description poetry that became its own art form. So I hope you're starting to see how, by starting with how when a person with a disability is experiencing sound or sight or their bodies or movement, can create new forms. So this is like a new form of sound poetry. Okay, let's see. Okay, I have 2 more examples for you. This piece was called Flow, and this was a dancer named Ginger Lane. And the conundrum that we were working on was, how do we leave a legacy when there is no canon? So what she was trying to do, she's the woman who is the older dancer. She was, when she made this piece, she was just turning 80 years old. She was one of the first integrative dance practitioners in the US. And part of what she was working with is, so much material had been developed by this dance company that she works with, but there wasn't a way to pass it on. She has a very unique body. Has quadriplegia from an accident. So the movement that she's created is not something you can teach exactly to another person with a disability, because their body is different. So if she wants to teach her movement to another dancer who uses a wheelchair, they might have different abilities. But how do you teach that? How do you draw on a body of work, and how do you create one for the next generation? I'm not sure what's going on here in Korea, but at different sites in the United States, people are coming up with ways to notate choreography. But when you no longer have a standard body to perform the choreography, you are not teaching the same movement, you're having to translate it onto a different disabled body. So what she was doing in this piece called Flow, she is exploring dance across the lifespan and how it's handed down generation to generation. So how do you think about generation in disability when the identity of disability is most often not a family one, right? Because you might be the only person with a disability in your family. So if you have an identity that is generational, you can pass on through a family. So she was thinking about disabled family, and she danced with dancers of different ages and different kinds of disabilities. One of them was her granddaughter, to interpret movement across generations and different bodies. But it was her movement. So it was dancers of different ages and different movement capacities, but all learning the same movement. So we have to think about when we pass on the art that we create, like if it's choreography or if it's theater, how do we teach it when you've made it for a unique body? So that was a very exciting piece, and she is still dancing into her 80s, which is wonderful. Okay, the last example is dancer Robbie Lee Williams, and he has a piece that he created called Am I My Pain? And this piece, he was interested in the conundrum of how do we explore the complexity of disability vulnerability without reifying an overcoming narrative. So what that means is he wanted to talk and explore pain and experiences of pain, but not have that create a feeling in the audience of pity or an experience of him overcoming pain to dance. And one of the ways he tried to do this was by incorporating spoken word poetry into his dance. And that created a new form. He worked with 3 other dancers, and the dancers represented kind of different aspects of his own physical experiences of pain. And these were all dancers who also have chronic pain. So how does since he was not a theater artist or a poet, he was trying to figure out how to use words and movement together. So that's the last piece. I just want to summarize kind of where we were. Oh, perfect, my timer just went off. So I'll give you my summary. So the work shared I think in this festival, from looking at what has been created and shared here. I went to the exhibits yesterday and saw what was there. I'm seeing a similar impulse with artists with disabilities and their allies everywhere. And what I would like you to consider when you're viewing this work is how are new aesthetics being created in both the content and the form? So both in what the work is about, but also how it's represented. So the idea is to start with disability experience rather than the traditional form, and to consider the emotional and physical experiences of impairment in terms of proprioception, or the way we relate to our bodies in space, but also what we experience inside our bodies through interoception. How can you look at the work and think about time? So I'm thinking of the piece that was on the exhibit here with the different clay figurines and how those were created over a period of months. And so you can see like a whole process unfold through those images. But thinking about time, thinking about space, how we might adapt space or start with spaces that are how we experience them rather than how they are adapted. Thinking about new stories, new ways of using language. Thinking about disability culture and community. What happens when disabled people get together and make new things? And also about how access and accommodations can be put into a piece from the beginning rather than at the end. I think that was it. All right, well, thank you so much for your attention today. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed sharing this work from the Chicago disability arts community with you.
감사합니다. Thank you. 네, 저 사실 그 장애 예술을 고민하는 한국의 많은 창작자들 혹은 이론가들도 다 가지고 있는 질문들이 있잖아요. 도대체 장애 미학이란 무엇이고 장애를 재현하는 때 우리가 맞닥뜨리게 되는 언제나 그 복잡한 퍼즐 같은 요소들이 있는데 그런 이슈들을 역시 이제 캐리슨달 교수님도 다 가지고 있었고 이제 그것들을 다루는 일정한 작업들도 소개해 주셔서 또 나름의 정의들도 내려주셔서 아주 흥미롭고 뭔가 이 작품들도 굉장히 궁금한 그런 시간이었습니다. 그런데 저희가 어쨌든 저를 포함해서 장애인의 시간을 다르게 경험하기 때문에 쉬어야 합니다. 시간이 없어도 화장실 가야 되거든요. 그래서 지금 11시 13분인데요. 저희가 5분 쉬겠습니다. 근데 5분 쉰다고 하면 10분 쉬시겠죠? 안 됩니다. 5분만 쉬겠고요. 시간이 혹시 더 필요하신 분은 조금 더 쓰시더라도 일단은 5분간 휴식하고 다시 시작하겠습니다. 네, 저희 다시 시작을 해보려고 합니다. 네, 사실 저한테 많은 질문들이 있는데, 근데 저희가 시간이 많지는 않기 때문에 여기 이제 오신 분들의 질문을 더 받고 싶어서 일단 저는 좀 간단하게 오늘 이야기를 들으면서 제가 뭐 좀 드리고 싶었던 이야기, 예시 같은 걸 말씀드리고 질문은 이제 방청석의 청중분들에게 질문을 받아보도록 하겠습니다. 만약에 질문이 안 나오면 혹은 좀 늦게 나오면 제가 시간이 남으면 질문을 드리도록 할게요. 우선 저는 이제 이번 그 몇 가지 굉장히 저를 비롯한 창작자들이 했던 고민들을 좀 더 일원화 시켜주시는 작업들도 있고 또 실제 작업 공연의 예시들도 보여주셔서 대단히 재밌었어요. 너무 특히 어떤 재현적 커난드럼이라고, 레프레젠털 커난드럼이라고 정리해 주신 것들이 있잖아요. 그래서 그것들이 실제로 이제 우리가 장애를 가지고 어떤 작업을 할 때 항상 하게 되는 고민들을 잘 이론적으로 정리했다는 느낌을 많이 받았습니다. 그리고 또 창작자로서는 저도 항상 그런 고민이 있었거든요. 내가 하는 활동 혹은 내가 하는 저는 이제 공연을 주로 했는데 이런 작업에 계보가 있는가, 누군가가 이것을 했는가, 나는 어떤 정통 규범이 있는가, 무엇에 기대어서 이 작업이 좋은지 혹은 나쁜지 또는 어떤 것에 기대어서 다른 사람에게 이 작업을 전달할 수 있는지 뭐 이런 것에 대한 고민들이 많이 있었던 것 같습니다. 근데 관련해서 사실 한국에는 제가 한국의 이제 장애와 관련된 공연의 계보를 찾다가 한국에는 이제 아주 잘 알려진 전통춤 중에 병신춤이라는 춤이 있습니다. 크립 댄스라고 해야 될까요? 근데 이것이 이제 한국의 수백 년 전부터 전통적으로 이렇게 민중들이 어떤 상류 계급인 양반이라고 하는 상류 계층을 좀 놀리기도 하고 희화화하기도 하는 그래서 좋게 보면 약간 계급 해방적인 의미를 가진 그런 춤입니다. 그런데 이제 다 같이 이제 야외 아웃도어에 모여가지고 야외 공간에 모여서 장애를 가진 몸을 표현하는 것이에요. 거기에는 굉장히 다양한 장애를 가진 몸들이 등장합니다. 우리가 현대적으로 얘기하는 장애 유형, 그 유형들이 다 포함될 만큼 대단히 다양한 몸들이 표현되는데요. 물론 지금은 물론 그 춤이 여러 가지 정치적 올바름의 문제라든가 이런 또 현대 한국의 장애인 인권 운동이 이제 발전하면서 그런 전통에 대한 비판도 많이 있었기 때문에 지금은 대단히 신중하게 그 춤을 전수하는 분들도 또 수행하는 분들도 비교적 신중하게 접근을 하고 있고 학계에서도 그것이 갖고 있는 그런 문제들이 또 있지만 동시에 아주 오히려 더 소수자에게 해방적인 어떤 가치를 품고 있는 것이다. 뭐 이런 의견들도 있고 다양한 논쟁들이 있습니다. 근데 그럼에도 불구하고 제가 그 춤의 계보를 쫓다가 그걸 발견하고서 한편으로는 불쾌하지만 한편으로는 또 반가운 장애를 가진 신체가 어떤 공연에 대단히 중요한 표현의 주체로 등장했구나라고 하는 사실을 만났는데, 그런데 중요한 것은 제가 아는 한 실제로 장애인이 거기에 등장한 적은 한 번도 없다는 겁니다. 예. 그러니까 그 병신춤의 댄서들은 사실은 모두 비장애인들입니다. 그리고 실제 공연에서도 장애를 가진 몸을 추다가 다음 막으로 넘어가면 다시 비장애인이 되어서 다 같이 해방의 춤을 추는 것이죠. 예. 그러한 춤이어서 사실 이것이 장애를 가진 몸이 등장하긴 했지만 실제 장애를 가진 어떤 사람이 춤을 추었던 계보와는 무관한 것이라는 아쉬움이 있었고요. 또 이제 말씀하신 대로 그 장애인들은 이런 예술학교에서 교육받기 어렵지 않습니까? 그리고 저도 한번 예술학교에 지원했다가 떨어진 적이 있어요. 근데 물론 제가 이거 너무 많이 얘기해서 죄송합니다. 근데 그거 뭐 제가 사실 오디션을 못 봤기 때문이라고 생각하는데요. 근데 어쨌든 제가 얘기하고 싶은 거는 그 예술학교에서 이제 어떤 정치인에게 답변을 할 때 뭐라고 얘기했냐면 전통예술원이에요. 제가 물론 지원한 건 다른 전공입니다만 말씀드린 병신춤을 연구하는 전통예술원에서 뭐라고 답했냐면 그 답변은 이제 그 정치인이 당신의 학교는 왜 장애가 있는 예술가들을 선발하지 하는데 소극적이냐 이제 이런 질문에 대한 답변이었어요. 근데 그 답변에서 전통 예술을 잘 배우려면 굉장한 인내심과 고통을 감수하는 능력이 있어야 된다. 그런 것이 필요하다. 이성적으로 작품을 훈련해가는 것이 필요하다라고 얘기했던 것이죠. 근데 그 전통 예술원에 혹시 안 오셨죠? 전통 예술원에 사실 그 학교 사실 이건 한국의 모든 교육기관이 사실 똑같은 상황일 텐데요. 특정 학교의 문제라기보다는. 근데 그 전통 예술원에서 이제 실제로 병신춤의 해방적 가능성 이런 거에 대한 논문도 쓰시고 연구도 하는 학교라는 것이죠. 그러니까 결국은 그 아까 이제 프리다 칼로 전시 말씀해 주셨던 것처럼 주류적인 예술 기관이나 예술 창작자들이 장애를 이제 가져다 썼을 때 실제로 그것이 진짜 장애를 가지는 어떤 창작자들을 오히려 배제했을 때에만 비로소 장애를 갖다 쓸 수 있는 지금 그런 구조에 우리가 한국도 그런 어떤 상황에 놓여 있는 것이 아닌가라는 생각을 많이 하게 됩니다. 그래서 말씀해 주신 대로 미국의 이런 여러 시도들 그런 공식적인 교육기관을 통해 훈련을 받기 어렵지만 다양한 커뮤니티나 또 여러 분야에서 훈련을 받은 소수의 사람들이 서로 연결되어서 다양한 작업들을 시도하고 또 특히 접근성과 관련해서 굉장히 창의적인 방식으로 장애의 경험을 외부화하는 그런 시도들을 제가 보면서 매우 많은 이제 그런 특정한 주류적인 교육기관을 상대로 한 어떤 싸움이랄까요, 협상이랄까요, 도전이랄까요, 그런 것도 물론 필요하겠지만 또 이 장애 혹은 얼라이들, 장애 예술의 어떤 지지자들 혹은 참여자들이 다 같이 어떤 특정한 우리가 어떤 커뮤니티로서 연결되어서 이런 시도들을 해나가는 것이 갖고 있는 어떤 힘과 중요성을 이번 강의를 통해서도 다시 한번 들을 수 있었습니다. 저는 뭐 희망하기로는 사실 한국에 굉장히 흥미로운 작업을 하는 창작자들이 많이 있거든요. 여기 소개해 주신 얘들만큼이나 재미있는 작업들 많이 있어서 캐리슨 대학 교수님과도 여러 교류를 통해서 우리가 더 이 커뮤니티가 더 확장될 수 있으면 좋겠다. 우리가 호라이즌틀 아이덴티티라고 하잖아요. 그러니까 장애라고 하는 건 수평적 정체성이잖아요. 부모님에게는 없지만 바다를 건넌 곳에는 있는 것이죠. 비슷한 고민을 한 사람이 연결될 수 있는 기회가 더 많이 생겼으면 좋겠다는 마음을 가져봅니다. 네, 제가 몇 가지 질문이 있지만 일단은 코멘트까지만 하고 이제 우리 청중석에서 제가 질문은 아니지만 혹시 그래도 우리 샌달 교수님 제가 이야기한 것에 혹시 덧붙이실 코멘트가 있다면 들어보고 넘어가겠습니다. 네.
Yes, the example of the crip dance sounds very complicated because it sounds like, if I'm understanding correctly, it's a traditional dance that's created representing disabled people, but not danced by disabled people. And now there's disabled people who are entering the dance, or at least the person you talked about. So that's like a double or triple appropriation move. We were talking before the event today about freak shows and how interested disabled people are in the freak show, and that is a kind of performance lineage, but it's one that's considered very shameful. Did you have freak shows here in Korea? Or something similar?
프릭쇼에 완전히 해당하는 공연이 있었다고 보긴 어렵지만 일부 서커스 공연에서 프릭쇼와 유사한 방식의 공연자들이 일부 있었습니다. 프릭쇼처럼 대대적인 엔터테인먼트는 아니었죠.
Okay. So I think it's a trend also in disability art for us to take some historical representations and claim them for ourselves and then rework them. And that gives you a lot of power, I think, to shape a narrative that has been used to shape you. There's a lot of twists and turns in this scenario, but I do notice that as a trend. And it's really important too, because sometimes when representation is made, that can be oppressive. And then you're excluded from participating in it, like from when you were talking about being excluded from educational opportunities, but when you have the opportunity to take it back, then you can use the power of the exclusion to fight back. There's a lot of twists and turns in this comment.
네. 저희가 아까 프릭쇼 얘기를 잠깐 했었거든요. 이 강연 시작하기 전에. 네, 감사합니다. 일단 저희가 시간이 별로 없어서 청중 질문을 받아볼게요. 아마 굉장히 많은 물음들이 있으실 것 같아서 저희 마이크를 갖다 주시는 거죠. 손을 드시면. 네. 그러면 편하게 손이나 뭐 다른 방식으로 사인을 주시면 제가 확인하고 마이크를. 네, 여기 앞에 두 번째 줄인가요? 네. 질문은 너무 길게 하시지 약간 간단하게 주세요. 네.
저는 35년차 장애인입니다. 지금 그게 장애예술이고 장애인 예술이고, 그네 아까 말씀하신 진저레인, 그다음 맥보텟 같은 공연을 할 때 어떤 사람이 보고 그건 돈을 내는지, 그래서 또 어떤 반응 같은 게 어땠는지 좀 알고 싶습니다.
네, 감사합니다.
That's a good question, because when we're thinking about the artist, we also need to think about the disabled audience, because one of the things I said defines disability art is that it's made for disabled people. So most of our work is free, that we find funding and organizations that will offer free admission, or we have, when we do charge money, there can always be a request if finances are a barrier and we find a way to pay for the tickets. And we have people from the community of other disabled artists. They can be people who are deaf, blind, mental health disabilities, all kinds. And those are the people that we know. But we also reach out to people who are harder to reach. So there might be people who've been in an institution that we will find a way to bring people to the performances. There are a lot of disabled people who don't have access to transportation. So there's cost, but there's transportation. We have had issues trying to bring people into a museum where we do a lot of collaborations. It's the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago. It's one of the more prestigious organizations. And folks tend to be very intimidated to go there because they might be, I've had people tell me, I'd like to go, but I don't know how to dress. I don't think I have the right clothes. Or they might be afraid that their behavior would, they've been excluded because of behaviors too. So what we do is we work with organizations to relax the rules so that people can behave differently in this space and welcome more people. And I think that that's important, that we don't just bring like middle-class disabled people, but that we bring people who don't usually go to art spaces, or people who might be able to get there, might be able to afford it, but who are just intimidated by the space. So we are working to over the years, Bodies of Work has been around since 2004. So we have an audience that is used to coming. They trust us. So if we do an event in a particular space, they will come because they know that they will be welcome and that there will be accommodations already there for them. I think that's kind of what you're building here, right? That people will know that when they come here, that it will be a space where they will be welcome and accommodated.
네, 감사합니다. 여기 모두 요 예술 주간에 우리 일본의 이토아사 선생님도 왔다 가셨는데 그 관련해서 그분이 직접 관여한 것은 아니지만 일본에서 흥미로운 사례는 시각장애인 분이 90년대 후반에 전맹 시각장애인이시거든요. 근데 그냥 미술관에 가서 미술관에 연락해서 내가 앞이 안 보이는데 전시 관람을 좀 안내해 줄 수 있겠느냐라고 전화를 하신 거예요. 일본의 도쿄도 아니고 외곽 지역 미술관에. 처음에 그 미술관은 저희는 그런 서비스가 없는데요 라고 답을 한 것이죠. 근데 이분이 계속 전화를 여러 군데에 걸었습니다. 여러 미술관에. 그래서 한 미술관이 일단 한번 와보세요 이렇게 된 거예요. 그래서 그분이 미술관에 방문했고, 그래서 그분이 그러니까 거기는 큐레이터가 지나가면서 그 큐레이터 분이 설명을 해주신 거죠. 이 그림은 어떤 그림이고요, 어떻게 보입니다. 이런 거를 일종의 음성 해설인 거죠. 그렇게 시작이 되었는데 지금 그 이후로 이분이 20년 넘게 지금은 이제 시각장애인과 함께 전시를 관람하는 워크숍을 하고 있습니다. 근데 이분은 뭔가를 만지는 작품을 원하는 것이 아니에요. 아까 여기도 시각장애인은 뭔가 대단한 청각을 갖고 있을 거라고 하는 그런 약간의 신비화된 그런 이야기 해주셨는데, 그분도 마찬가지로 나는 특별히 그런 거 없다. 특별히 민감한 것도 아니고 만지는 걸 딱히 좋아하지도 않으시는 거죠. 그분이 좋아하시는 거는 실제 나와 같이 간 사람들이 실제 그 그림 앞에서 그 그림을 설명해 주는 이야기를 듣는 걸 좋아하시는 거예요. 그래서 그렇게 시작된 것이 지금은 이제 굉장히 확장되어서 지금 우리가 음성 해설이라고 부르는 특정한 전시의 어떤 그 시작되기 전에 이미 그 작업이 이루어졌던 것이죠. 그래서 그분이 이제 시라토리라고 하는 분이거든요. 시라토리 씨라고 하는 분인데 그 얼마 전에 책도 번역되어 나왔는데요. 말씀하신 대로 사실 지금 뭔가 예술 어떤 창작 작품을 장애 때문이든 사회적 상황 때문이든 이렇게 나와서 참여하지 못하는 분들이 미국도 아직 많이 있다는 것이고 한국도 여전히 많이 계신데 뭔가 그런 어떤 그 시대의 관점에서는 다소 터무니없어 보이는 시도. 전화 90년대 후반에 전화 하실 수 있으시겠어요? 저는 못할 것 같거든요. 90년대라는 시대적 배경에서 갑자기 전화해가지고 굉장히 어려운 일일 것 같잖아요. 근데 그런 일들을 촉발시키는 게 어떤 그분은 굉장히 개인적으로 놀라운 일을 하신 거지만 그것이 어떤 현재 장애 예술의 어떤 역할이고 또 뭐 책임이 아닌가 이런 생각도 해봤습니다. 네, 다음 또 질문 들어볼까요? 네, 혹시 네. 좀 기다리면 대단히 많이 나온다는 걸 저는 알고 있어요. 그래서 어색해하지 않습니다. 아, 네. 여기 앞에 여기 네, 세 번째 줄.
Thank you so much for your talk. Really interesting and fantastic work. Thanks. And I wondered, when we make work that directly addresses a stereotype that we think somebody holds of our disability, how do we end up? How do we avoid reinforcing that stereotype? What strategies might we use? Thank you.
That is a perfect example of a representational conundrum. Yeah, and it's one of I think it's impossible not to. That's why it's a perfect conundrum, because you can't address stereotypes without calling it back up. That's how it is. So the film that we made called Code of the Freaks, we had this issue come up where the film includes many clips from movies across 100 years of filmmaking are organized around themes. So for instance, we have a whole bunch of film clips where blind people are driving cars. There just happens to be a stereotype that comes up over and over. Or we'll have this stereotype where one of our interviewees said, the first thing that blind people seem to want you to do is to feel their face in movies. So there's a lot of, you see a lot of Hollywood movies where someone is feeling, a blind person wants to feel someone's face. So we make fun of the stereotypes while we show them. But one of the stereotypes we noticed was about people with intellectual disability or learning disability. And they were very harmful ways of representing people's physical bodies. I don't even want to describe it because I feel like by describing it, I'll reinforce it. But they were very disrespectful and supposedly comic, but it wasn't funny. So we had a similar sequence of maybe 10 clips of the same ugly stereotype, but then we realized that we didn't want to show it because the takedown was like comic violence. We were making fun of the stereotypes, but it has to benefit the person being represented. So the kind of it required an intellectual capacity to understand we were making fun of somebody making fun of disabled people, and we didn't feel that was accessible. We had focus groups where we would show the films, and it ended up making people very upset. They didn't think it was funny. So we didn't include it. So that's an example of one of the strategies that I've used, is thinking about whether when you're deconstructing a stereotype or addressing it, who's benefiting? And does that group, is it really helpful to them to take down that stereotype? So that's just a couple things that we've tried doing, but it's a really good question. So that when you find a representational conundrum, that tends to be what I like to do, is go there and then experiment with all different ways and see how different audience members respond. And because you can't solve them, there's an endless arenas for experimentation. So, yeah.
네, 감사합니다. 네, 또 다른 질문이 저 뒤에 있으시네요. 저쪽 맨 뒤에 저 두 번째 줄 먼저 드셨는데요. 네.
장애예술과 미학, 그리고 어떤 이 미학이라는 건 비평의 지점과 멀어질 수는 없는 것 같은데요. 그 장애예술을 지금은 좀 어떤 절대적 포용, 환대의 측면에서 좀 바라보고 그 표현을 수용하는 분위기에 있다는 저는 생각이 드는데, 이런 장애예술을 좀 절대적 포용이나 환대의 측면으로 바라보면 많은 딜레마를 놓친다는 생각이 들어요. 그게 궁극적인 지향점이 될 수는 있지만 그 과정에서 여러 세부 논의나 경험의 교류 없이 좀 이론 속에 약간 실천을 구겨넣는다는 생각이 들기도 하는데요. 예를 들면 저의 경험에서는 한 장애의 유형이 다양하게 있지만 장애를 구분짓는 어떤 신체, 몸이기 이전에 그 사람들을 다양성을 가진 개인으로 바라보기를 가장 크게 놓치고 장애를 가진 신체를 그냥 절대적 환대의 어떤 지점에서 비평 없이 포용하는 어떤 그런 측면이 있다는 생각이 좀 드는데, 두 가지 질문이 있는데 이 지점에서 앞으로 어떤 방향으로 이 장애예술을 바라보는 미학과 비평의 지점이 정립되거나 발전되기를 기대하시는지 궁금하고, 두 번째는 10년 후에 다시 이런 장이 열린다면 어떤 논의들이 이루어지기를 기대하시는지 궁금합니다.
Oh, that's a good thing to dream about. What would that be? Trying to make sure that I understand all parts of your question. So what I've noticed is when we talk about inclusion, as I said at the beginning of the talk, unfortunately, because disabled people have not had the opportunity to explore their difference, inclusion always looks like the normal. And because it always looks like the normal, we never succeed. And so by focusing on difference, then we can go back to the mainstream and change it, but with information about what an alternative might be. So that to me then says we can expand what the arts look like, what they feel like, who can be involved, because we've changed what's normal. As long as we don't spend the time with ourselves and each other and our allies experimenting, then we will just reproduce systems that are actually inaccessible. So what I'm hoping is that as this work becomes more, as it proliferates, as we get more and more of it, that it will change institutions. They will want to include us, but not on their terms, but on our terms. Does that make sense?
지금 해주신 질문 중에서, 그러니까 이걸 확인하고 싶은데요. 지금은 어쨌든 캐리 샌달이 말하신 것처럼 장애인들이 자기의 차이나 고유성을 탐구하고 그것을 통해서 어떤 표현 방법을 훈련받을 기회가 없었기 때문에 현재는 일단 다양한 몸을 가진 장애인들을 어떤 예술씬에서 절대적으로 환대하는 어떤 그러한 것이, 물론 이제 그것도 그렇게 절대적인 환대를 하는 예술씬도 한 줌에 불과하긴 합니다만, 그 한 줌을 전제로 얘기하죠. 그 한 줌 바깥의 사람들은 우리가 일단 제외하고요. 그것을 이제 문제의식을 가진 사람들은 적어도 절대적으로 환대하고 있고 하는 분위기인데, 그러나 개개인의 창작자들은 굉장히 다른 상황과 또는 근데 이것까지 포함하신 건 제가 모르겠지만 확인하면 굉장히 비평적으로 다양한 창작자로서의 역량이랄까요? 이 적절한 용어인지 모르겠습니다. 어쨌든 다양한 창작자로서의 역량이나 특성을 가지고 있는데, 그런 것들을 우리가 분별하기가 어렵고 그냥 이제 어떤 차이로서 환대하는 것에 머물러 있다. 그 문제의식을 전달하고자 하신 게 맞나요?
네, 우선 저희 어수선 언어를 선생님께서 너무 잘 단어를 잡아서 설명해 주신 것 같아서 너무 감사드리고, 사실 저는 이 주제에 대해서 관심을 갖고 공부하고 있는 대학생이고, 선생님께서 그 얼마 전에 아르코에서 하셨던 공연도 봤고, 그 국립중앙박물관에 가서 열렸던 포럼에서도 그 마지막 패널 토론회까지 들었었는데, 선생님께서 장애예술도 구리면 구리다고 말할 수 있어야 되지 않냐 그렇게 말씀하셨던 게 되게 인상이 깊었고, 근데 그런 측면에서 냉정하게 뭔가 언제까지나, 지금은 저희가 한국에서는 여전히 접근성에 대한 확대조차도 아직은 중요하고 해결해야 할 단계적인 문제이지만 선생님이 말씀하셨던 것까지 제가 생각은 했지만 질문에 이렇게 내용 속에 넣지는 못했던 것 같습니다. 네.
네. 그러니까 어떻게 장애예술 창작자 개개인을 적절하게 비평할 것인가의 이슈인 것 같아요. 그런 비평적 언어가 우리에게 아직은 없고, 또 뭔가 그렇게 어떤 그 창작물의 미학적 성취를 평가하기보다는 일단 많은 기회들을 더 많이 만들자, 그런 것에 현재 우리의 논의가 좀 머물러 있는 것 같다. 더 뭔가 개개인의 장애를 가진 창작자를 우리가 정확하게 평가하는, 정확하다는 게 좀 이상할 수도 있지만 적절하게 평가하는 그런 노력이 필요할 수도 있을 것 같다는 그런 말씀으로 들리는데요. 그 부분을 좀 보충해 주실 수 있을까요?
Yeah, so criticism usually implies that there's a standard of what is good. But if disabled people have not been part of the process of determining what is good, then the criticism cannot be really helpful. So I think at the beginning of the talk, I was saying that when we don't have teachers who understand our bodies, or there's no curriculum for us, then there's almost nothing to say. I mean, except for, kind of a very paternalistic, just clapping at anything we do, which isn't helpful. Or else, what I've noticed is critics will talk about everything except what's on stage. So some of this work, for instance, will create this completely innovative dance piece. And then we'll look in the paper at what the critics say, and they'll say, this dance made me think about what it means to be human. And we're like, okay, so you already didn't think of us as human, and you learned we're human. Okay, but what was the dance? What did you see on stage? right? Because there's no critical language. This is what I'm going to be talking about in the workshop. We're trained not to talk about disabled people. So then when we get a new piece of art that we don't have a standard for, then usually people will talk about everything but the work. Right? So that has been a real frustration, and one that I'm a scholar and I write about disability art. What kind of vocabulary can we use? So when this is part of what the dancers were looking at. If we don't have language like you would have in ballet, we know the ballet terms. You can name the choreography, and then you know whether someone's doing it well or someone's not doing it well, or someone's doing it in a new way. But if you have no baseline, then how do you describe it? How do you understand it? That is a huge conundrum. It's a huge representational conundrum. So, but part of what I'll be doing in the workshop this afternoon is getting us to figure out how we can talk about what we see or what we experience, because that has been a real issue. So critics will say, the other thing that critics will say is, to a very innovative dance piece, this piece made me think about what is dance. Okay, well, that's good. It's good to challenge what you think dance is, but what did you see? What was there? That's what we don't have the language for, and we don't have the traditions for, but I'm hoping that it still moves audiences, and audiences still have a response. They just don't know yet how to articulate. Is that more close to the answer to your question?
그 그러니까 뭘 봐야 되고 그것을 어떻게 말하는지 언어가 빈곤하다는 없다는 말씀에 저도 매우 동의하고요. 사실 장애인 창작자로서 저도 그런 것 같습니다. 네. 제가 하는 작업을 어떻게 이해할지 잘 모르겠거든요. 아직은. 네. 지금 하는 것이 프릭쇼의 그냥 반복인가, 아니면 장애를 가진 정체성을 이 커넌드럼을 충분히 이 속에서 뭔가 다른 이 딜레마 속에서 뭔가를 발견했는가, 아니면 그냥 더 멋있어 보이고 싶어하는 욕망에 불과한가 모르겠어요. 항상 그런 고민을 합니다. 근데 어떻게 말할지 모르기 때문인 것 같아요. 그런 점들을 계속해서 저희가 탐구하고 해야 될 매우 중요한 이슈인 것 같습니다. 되게 아주 중요한 주제이지만 시간이 많지 않기 때문에 다음 질문으로 넘어갈게요. 네. 여기 아까. 네.
안녕하세요. 오늘 너무 많은 영감을 주시는 강연과 질문과 대답들이 너무 좋고요. 저도 사실은 이 말 안 하려고 그러셨는데, 저도 사실은 무용 관련해서 글을 쓰고 있는 사람이고요. 오늘 이 자리에 온 것도 이런 장애예술에 대한 어떤 비평적 언어가 매우 부족하다라는 그런 고민 때문에 이런 좋은 기회에 좀 공부를 해야겠다 그래서 계속 이 강연들을 듣고 있는데요. 정말로 장애예술을 보고 그거를 글로 쓸 때 가장 고민되는 지점들이 이제 교수님께서 말씀해 주신 예술 자체, 그들이 가진 예술 자체를 어떻게 언어화할 것인가, 이 문제가 가장 크다고 생각합니다. 근데 오늘 말씀해 주신 그 재현의 딜레마를 어떻게 해결할 것인가, 뭐 이런 이제 재현으로부터 벗어난 예술에 대한 고민 같은 거, 그런 거에서 많은 어떤 길이 좀 보이는 것 같습니다. 그래서 그 부분에 대해서 감사드리고 싶고요. 제가 아까 원래 질문 드리려고 했던 거는 아까 그 청각장애인들을 위해서 통역을 제공을 할 때 그냥 그 소리가 어떻다라기보다 굉장히 비유적으로 설명을 하셨잖아요. 뭐 이제 노인이 뭐 귀뚜라미랑 같이 배수관, 송수관 살고 있다, 왜 이런. 그러니까 그렇게 비유적으로 텍스트를 만들 때 그걸 만드는 사람들은 누구고, 그리고 그런 비유를 하는 어떤 뭐 규칙은 아니겠지만 뭔가 어떤 창작자만의 프로토콜이라든가 그런 것들이 있는지, 그게 어떤 리서치 연구를 기반으로 하고 있는 건지 궁금합니다.
I think that it's based on us being together, exploring the questions and coming up with experimental ways of addressing them. Because when there's not a tradition, then the part that's the most fun is trying to come up with the ideas. But since I'm a scholar of performance, what I've started to do, and I'll talk about this afternoon, is to go back to the fundamentals of criticism. So whenever you're approaching something that you want to critique, and I write about theater mostly, theater and live performance. I'll start with, what did I see? Just the basic question, what did I see? And just coming up with ways to describe what I saw. And the aesthetics points that I suggested, like what was happening with space, what is happening with time, what was the person's body or mobility device? How do you describe it? And then what did you hear? So what did you see? What did you hear? What did you experience? Like, what, as a spectator, did you feel in your body? And paying attention to that. And then putting that all together, what did it mean? So when I used to teach in a theater department, I taught performance criticism. Those were the questions that we would bring to introductory classes. For the first year students, those were the questions we would ask them. We'd tell them to go to a performance. What did you see? To describe everything you see. What did you hear? What did you experience? And what does it mean? And somehow we forget those questions when we look at disability art. Partly because we don't have good language to describe. If you describe a person, who is short, statured, if you're describing a little person, what language do you have to describe that person that doesn't have stigma attached to it? Those are the kind of questions that we have. Or if you have, for instance, like my body, if I'm walking on crutches, I have a very particular gait, the way I walk. I limp and my body swings. How do you describe that without it sounding stigmatizing? Because we're taught not to talk about, at least in the US, I'm not sure about Korean culture, but in the United States, we're taught it's not polite to talk about people's bodies who are different. So then when we put our bodies in front of everybody, then there's a lack of language. So I try to think about what are all the words I can use to just describe something. And if it's stigmatizing, how do I present it differently? So when I was talking about Chris Lenzo, the dancer who lost his legs, I try to be very matter of fact. His legs end in the middle of his thigh. Right? That's kind of a neutral description of what his body looks like. So going back to just describing something as simply as you can is like a first step. What happens in criticism is people will jump all the way to this person's dance is about his inspirational overcoming of his amputation. And we're like, really? How do you know that? Where did that meaning come from? Is it just because you can't say this person's legs end above his knees? You jump right to the meaning. I'm not saying you. I'm just saying in general that's what critics do. They don't start with what they see. They jump to an interpretation that is based on a lot of stereotypes. So to me, it's like, okay, I have a plan. Describe what I see. Describe what I hear. What am I feeling in my body? That's something we can all do. So when I'm watching dance, when I was watching this performance by dancers who use wheelchairs on the ramps, I had my first experience of what's called kinesthetic mirroring. Kinesthetic mirroring is when You feel in your body the movement of the person you're watching. So when you watch a roller coaster, do you have the feeling inside your body like your heart is coming up in your chest when you watch someone on a roller coaster? I had that experience watching a dancer in a wheelchair because my body knows what that movement is. So when I had a lot to do with that as a critic. I was like, I haven't experienced this because when I watch someone who's not disabled, my body doesn't respond that way because I don't know that movement. So pay attention to like what is your interoception, what is inside your body when you're watching something. What's your heart doing? You know, are you feeling yourself tense? Are you feeling empathy? I hope that gives you some places to start. It's really difficult because in our cultures, disability always means something already before we even have a chance to look at what's there. Does that make sense? Okay.
네, 감사합니다. 지금 시간이 12시 4분인데요. 그래도 뭐 혹시 하나 Carrie, can you have one more question?
It's fine with me.
하나 정도 더 받아도 될까요? 네. 그럼 짧은 질문 하나 더 받겠습니다. 네.
예, 저는 그 재현의 딜레마라는 그 용어에 대한 저의 이해를 좀 더 분명히 하고 싶어서 이렇게 질문을 하게 됐는데요. 제가 뉴로다이버스라고 요즘은 쓰기도 하고 한국에서는 여전히 발달장애라는 용어를 쓰는데 발달장애 작가들의 작품을 본 그 감동? 이게 기존의 미술에서 보지 못한 그 감동 때문에 제가 이제 뭐 장애예술 관련 그런 행사도 준비하고 그랬었는데 오늘 쓰시는 그 재현의 딜레마라는 그 용어에서 그때 이제 여러 작가들이 있었는데 어떤 작가들에 대해서 기성의 그 예술가들이 멘토를 해줬는데 멘토를 하게 되는 그 결과물은 뭐냐면 발달장애 작가들이 가지는 그 거칠고 새로운 맛이 주는 기쁨이 상쇄돼 버리는 거예요. 그러니까 조금 전에 그 김원영 그 모더레이터가 말씀하신 것처럼 차이에 화도할 수밖에 없는 그런 시점인데 근데 그 재현의 딜레마라는 용어를 썼을 때는 오늘 우리의 예술이 뭐 계보가 있는가라든가 기존의 중거에 맞추지 못할 때 이 장애 예술이 어느 지점에 설 것인가 그런 고민들을 얘기하셨는데 이 새로움이라는 그런 관점에서 본다면 기존의 중거를 따를 경우에 장애인의 그 몸짓이라든가 아니면 뭐 발달 장애인이 가지는 선택하는 색이라든가 그런 것들이 주는 기쁨이 그냥 그 조약돌이 딸듯이 돌이 이제 뭐라 그럴까 물에 마찰에 의해서 닳아서 그냥 맨들맨들해지는 것처럼 그 고유의 기쁨이나 그것이 가지는 힘이 사라지거든요. 그래서 오늘 이 말씀하신 것 중에서 그 재현의 딜레마라는 게 기존의 이제 주류 예술에서 얘기했던 그런 제 몸짓에 나를 맞추려고 하는 것이 아니었는가라는 그런 생각이 들면서 오히려 재현의 딜레마가 아니라 재현으로부터 탈출이라든가 뭐 낙하라든가 아니면 뭐 그런 그 접근이 필요한 건지 아닌가 하는 생각이 드는데 제 관점이 재현의 딜레마를 좀 잘못 이해해서 나온 것이 아닌지 그 용어에 대해서 조금 더 설명을 해 주시면 좋겠습니다.
Right, so in your example of people with developmental disability and maybe their use of color, maybe there's the push and the pull between wanting to give people technical skills that are part of learning any artistic technique, and then also being free to discover what someone's body might do or someone's creative expression would be without those norms and standards. I think that's something you can't solve. That's what a conundrum is. Like, how do you teach technique because disabled artists want to be trained while also leaving room for new possibilities? That's like a classic conundrum. That's a really good one. So that would be then where you would go with your experimentation with that would just be something that you would want to figure out with the artists, the balance between teaching technique and then leaving room to create something new from the way that their body or their mind thinks about color or movement or what to do with an art material. So maybe the artist doesn't want to use the paintbrush to paint. Maybe they want to use the paintbrush to make sound, or maybe they want to use the paintbrush on their skin to feel what the paintbrush feels like. Maybe it becomes a dance or a new way of doing something with the paintbrush that's not painting. But at the same time, the artist deserves to learn how to paint traditionally. So I think that's the fun part for me, is trying to figure out how you can experiment then with whatever conundrum you identify.
네. 더 이야기를 하면 좋겠는데 시간이 9분 넘어서 여기서 저희 마쳐야 될 것 같습니다. 오늘 끝까지 참여해 주셔서 감사하고요. 우리 아주 흥미롭고 중요한 이야기를 다 던져주신 캐리 샌달 교수님께도 감사의 박수를 한번 드리면 좋겠습니다.
Thank you.